Good afternoon. Good afternoon, good morning, dear participants. Good evening. I'm pleased to open this third webinar of the UNESCO Chair, and I have a short service announcement before we start listening to our distinguished speakers today. I just wanted to remind you about a project that the Global Network has just launched, which is the Global Collaborative Digital Exhibition titled I Remember Water. You may have seen yesterday that we have sent by MailChimp the registration form, and above all, we have the extended deadline to December 20th to submit images about water memories, about our past. We started to talk about this topic since our very first meeting in Venice in 2017, 5 years ago, already 5 years ago, when we were discussing about possible archive with water memories from all over the world. Well, now that's the opportunity to share some materials. You will find the description of the call for participants, the call for contribution, in the two documents that are linked to the mail that we have sent yesterday. So we expect to build such an exhibition, which is not only a temporary event. We would like to make a kind of annual call for different contributions in order to build a digital archive with the water memories from all over the world. Not only water memories, but also contributions from artists and the views from the present that talk about different relationships with water. So the last, with the second webinar, the last time, we had the opportunity to focus on two distinct but very important thematic areas for us. First of all, with the contribution of Professor Jordi Ferreras, just to make a quick reminder for those of you who were not present, we explored how important are ancestral hydrotechnologies, which are part of our displays in museums, of our temporary exhibitions, or maybe are not already included. So it's also a kind of invitation to explore more this topic and see how your museum, your research activity, your institution can think about adding some part of our, how to say, water memories, water worlds, which otherwise risk to disappear, and how they can be also promoted through water museums. The second contribution of the last seminar was made by Mario Mesquita, who discussed an interesting tool, a digital tool to represent what we may term as a hidden or forgotten water heritage. In the previous webinar, I also focused on the hidden water heritage of Venice, and today we are going to talk again about the representation of water heritage through a different perspective from India. But I'm pleased to give the floor now to Sara to make the presentation of the two speakers. Please, Sara.
Thank you very much, Roberto. Thank you for this introduction and for resuming the last webinar. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone from my part too. I'm very pleased to be here with you also today for the third appointment of our webinar series. And today I'm very glad to take you outside Europe for the first time, precisely in the Uruguay, in Latin America, and in India, in Asia. So I'm very pleased to introduce you the first speaker, which is Professor Javier Taks. And Professor Taks is an Uruguayan anthropologist, currently chairman of the UNESCO Chair on Water and Culture at the University of the Republica in Uruguay. He obtained a PhD in social anthropology 20 years ago from the University of Manchester in UK. His main research interests revolve around environmental anthropology, sustainability and development, and urban mobility. And he is glad to say that he visited Venice, he visited us 3 times, and he would love to come back soon. So I really hope that Javier will be able to visit us and to visit Venice soon again. So today, Professor Taks will speak about mapping cultural water heritage in Latin America from a perspective of the human right to water. As usual, I ask you if you have any questions during the intervention, please write them in the chat box, and then we will have some 15 minutes to have question and answers. Otherwise, after the intervention, you will be able to raise your hand using the Zoom reaction, and we will be able to give you the floor. So, Javier, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Hey. Good morning, everyone from Uruguay, Montevideo, the capital city where I'm located. It's my pleasure to be part of this course and to contribute, modestly probably, to all this exchange of ideas among people from the water museums of the network. Thank you to Heriberto, to Sara for inviting me. I will divide my presentation in 3 parts. The first one will be a brief story of my own relation to water, and particularly to the human right to water. And from the beginning, I must say, I came to the human right to water and sanitation as an activist, because in Uruguay, maybe you know, it was a very strong social movement at the beginning of this century, that from 2002 and 2004, I will show a few pictures, was able to include in the constitutional law as a reform the human right to water and sanitation, along with other topics. So this is very important, because talking about memories and this new call from the WAMUNET, my argument will be somehow that these kind of struggles, these kind of social movements must be part of our cultural heritage and must be promoted. The second part of my presentation will be a kind of theoretical framework and how can we somehow work with the human right to water and its relation with culture, because it's not a very easy topic. I mean, it's full of controversies and dilemmas. So my point will be just to show and to share with you some of the theoretical concepts that I'm using, or I'm trying to use, just to make this link between the human right to water and our cultural heritage, and more than this, how we conceptualize the values of water these days, including the human right to water. And the third part, a few examples from Latin America of how can we map this cultural heritage. And I will just show a few, I wouldn't call them best practices, but some tips of where, if somebody wants to look for this cultural heritage based on the human right to water, should look for. So I'm going to share my presentation. I have a few PowerPoint slides, and I hope I will keep in time. As I said before, 2004, this was this referendum among Uruguayan citizens, because at the end of the 20th century and in the transition to the current century, there was a trend for the privatization of the water and sanitation systems in Uruguay, supply systems. So it happened in a few locations, 2 small cities in the eastern part of the country, that the private sector was in charge now of the supply of potable water and sanitation. But there was a signed agreement that it was hidden between the government and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, just to continue with this trend of the privatization of the public services. So when the people realized that, and particularly local inhabitants of a city which is next to the capital city of Montevideo, they realized that they will be the next ones to be to have this privatized system. And after knowing what happened in Argentina, in other countries in the region, so they decided to come together with environmental NGOs, trade unions, and other people, scholars from the university as well. So we organized this movement, and we succeeded in 2004 with more than 65% of the votes against privatization. I'm talking about these personal things because I think it's part of the context of the discussion and the debate about how the human right to water and sanitation is part of our short-term memories and probably can be linked to medium and long-term memories as well. So at that time, we were able also to meet people that were part of the what is called nowadays the water war of Cochabamba in Bolivia. It was a social revolt against one of the private companies at that time that they made measures, for instance, just to privatize, even as they said, the rain, the water coming from the sky that cannot be used by the people in the city. So they went to the streets and they started a struggle, and finally this private company had to leave the country. And so they came to Uruguay at the time that we were also in these mobilizations, and they told their stories, their memories, and also their lessons, as well as how the human right to water can be a limited concept if we don't put it in a more wider conversation with other concepts and notions of water. So we celebrate as well, and I did, in 2010, because we were part of this process as well, talking with people, lobbying, etc., when in 2010, the General Assembly of the United Nations declares the human right to water as a fundamental right. And although not all countries in the world ratificate this statement, this declaration, but it became part of this international ethical pronouncements, and states therefore have the obligation and the responsibility that to pursue the guarantee of the human right to water and sanitation. Some countries also, they put it on their own legislation, as it was the case for Uruguay, and it is also for Bolivia and Ecuador in South America, Chile as well, although Chile is a particular case that I will come back later to it.
Sorry, Javier, okay.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. I'm not sure if it is only my screen, but I cannot see your presentation. Sarah, can you confirm or can you check that?
Well, I can see it. I can see it.
Okay, you can see it correctly. So it's only my computer. Okay, sorry to
I'm
interrupt
afraid,
you.
yes.
Okay. I'm sorry for that, Heriberto. I will send it to you.
Everyone can see
later.
it's good. It's not a problem. Thank you.
Okay, so the final point in this first slide is that in 2014, 10 years after the succeed of the referendum in Uruguay, we wrote, or we compiled with some colleagues, this book, which is I'm trying to signal it with my mouse, that it's called Las Canillas Abiertas de América Latina, paraphrasing a very famous title from Eduardo Galeano, an Uruguayan writer and journalist. And what it means is the open tap waters of Latin America. And it means that the waters are open still for the process of privatization, although there is also these struggles against this trend. And the subtitle, I think it's important for what I'm going to say later, it's water as a common good and the human right, struggles and challenges after 10 years. And at the beginning, in 2004, we didn't talk about water as a common good at Commons. We were just talking about human rights. And this is something very important in the region, in Latin America. Nowadays, the human right to water and sanitation comes together with other notions of water. And this is something I will explain in a few minutes. And common goods, I think it's the important connection. And I will argue for this connection to be promoted and to be more visible in our work. So another point of personal story is that, as it was mentioned by Sarah, I became the chairman of the UNESCO Chair of Water and Culture in 2015, officially. And these are the thematic areas that we decided to work: human right to water and sanitation, obviously, the global culture of the water crisis, the narrative of the global culture of the water crisis, the encounter and disencounter between cosmovisions and ontologies, and here is where probably the indigenous experiences in Latin America and also in Uruguay, although Uruguay is a special case, and the discussion about if we have or not First Nations people in the country, it's very lively these days, and arts and water. But still, coming from this experience of, you know, the movement, the social movement for, oh, sorry. I'm trying to move. Yeah, okay. Coming from this story of the struggle for the human right to water and sanitation, I was a little bit frustrated that most of the demands as a chairman coming from the region and probably from the UNESCO itself, it was about a more folkloric idea of the relation between culture and water. And so I was wondering why it happened. And before I will tell you a little bit about this, let me just share with you what kind of activities we developed for this thematic axis of human right to water and sanitation. So, for instance, we organized a Back to the Tap campaign at the university level, because we think that this is also part of the struggle for the human right to water, just that the people can rely on public water and for you know, almost free. And also we distributed these bottles to be rechargeable, so we can mitigate and decrease the number of bottled water sold at the faculties at the university. Another thing is, okay, international workshops. For instance, I have a picture from Leo Hiller, which is the special rapporteur for the United Nations of that time. It was 2016. Also workshops with grassroots community organizations that are worried about especially the pollution of the rivers. They live next to the river in a city called Santa Lucia, not far from the main potabilization plant for the country. And also we did some research with engineers, just trying to experiment and to make pilot projects with rainwater harvesting in low-income neighborhoods in Montevideo and in the neighbor province of Canelones. But as I mentioned, these kind of activities were somehow more nationally located, and when we worked at the regional level, we felt this divorce between one idea of water and culture and something different that it's more involved with the politics of water, I would say. And I came across this important article from Lisa Iwasaki, who is a social scientist, interdisciplinary social scientist that worked in terms of development, and she worked at UNESCO for a year or a year and a half, and she did a research a quite interesting research that is published in the book that is on the bottom of my slide, Water for Life, Water for Whose Life? And she found out two groups of activities within the United Nations system, and particularly with the UNESCO Intergovernmental Hydrological Program. One group of activities can be included in the domain of the water cultures. And this is the links between water and particular indigenous groups, plus artistic expressions inspired by water. But there was another group of activities that she called water and cultural diversity. And in this group, you can include the water cultures ones, plus all the topics of governance, power, and rights. So in her words, is discussions of water and cultural diversity bring to the fore issues that are often omitted in discussions on water and culture. Most notable, and she mentions, A, social and political institutions that govern water use, B, contested uses of water, and C, the human right to water, which are all interlinked issues. So what I'm trying to say is that we must include the topics and discussions about the human right to water and sanitation within this group of activities, water and cultural diversity. I found this interesting. It gives me words just to mention. The work we do at the UNESCO chair on water and culture is more related with this idea of water and cultural diversity with the politics of water uses, water controversies within. So my argument in this regard, trying to put together my personal experience, which is also a collective experience in Uruguay and somewhere else elsewhere in Latin America, is that the experiences of the Latin American social movements for the human right to water and sanitation are water cultural heritage to be promoted and to make it more visible in our works. But a question for water museums and beyond is how can we educate, communicate, and discuss the dilemmas and controversies or conflicts of the human right to water and sanitation for a new ethical vision, as it was stated in the manifesto, this wonderful document from the WAMUNET that I can sign down many times. But how can we include all these dilemmas of the movements and the discussions of the human right to water and sanitation in our new ethical vision and our new water culture? So, firstly, let me share with you this diagram that came out from the book Water History for Our Times that was written by Hassan Fekri. And he's an Egyptian archaeologist, if I'm not wrong, and it was published by UNESCO. And in this diagram, what he tries to show us that in the history of water, or in water history for our civilizations, there are different paradigms of water management. And in particular times, historical stages, these paradigms were more or less dominant. So if you look on the first row, there are spiritual and religious paradigm that Hassan believes was the first to come out with the notions of sacred waters, for instance. And then you have others, aesthetic recreational paradigm that he relates with the Islamic civilizations of the commercial proto-industrial societies. Then the legal and ethical paradigm that we can relate with the human right to water, although it has a long history, but it's nowadays one of the main paradigms in the global financial system world, or this globalized world. Then the hydraulic engineer paradigm that is more related with the technological advances in the proto-industrial societies, and it's also connected with the idea of how to control, how to tame waters. The scientific paradigm with physics and chemistry as the core of this notion of water, which is connected with the idea of modern water, a more abstract notion of it. The economic and financial paradigm, that it has this evolution and become very strong, and you see a more darker color at the end. The ecological paradigm and the managerial paradigm that comes together, this idea that waters should be measured and should be also managed as maybe some others goods in society. So if we look at the final row in this diagram, it helps us to see that there are many different paradigms together, living together, contesting sometimes each other, trying to articulate each other in the current time. So for me, this is a very inspiring idea of how we can relate the human right to water notion within a paradigm that is also living together with others. And if we come to Latin America and the different notions, we can have these main concepts and values, the values of water in the continent, in the region. So we have the natural resource to be managed, water as a natural resource, and is related with this managerial paradigm. The commodity or economic good, that water is a commodity, it's also with us. And the human rights to water and sanitation, it's related with water as a public good. And here is where the state comes somehow as a very important agent and entity that must be considered. But also we have this idea of the common goods, water as a common good, that is also related with a legal and ethical paradigm, as well as the human rights. And a living entity and subject of rights, it's something that is much more visible nowadays, probably in relation with the claims from indigenous people or peasants and local communities in many parts. And so this is related with this spiritual and religion paradigm that, according to Hassan, it was weaker through history until today. Probably in the next presentation today, in the lecture, we will hear more about this idea of the spiritual and religion paradigm. But following another author that I think it's very important is Joan Martínez Alier, is a Catalan economist. He wrote this article, Languages of Valuation. So nowadays we have this idea of who decide which kind of language we use to talk about our relation to water. And this is something related with power relations in terms of discourse, in terms of narratives. So we must understand the human right to water and sanitation in this struggle as well for the languages of valuation. Just to remind us a little bit, what is the definition of the three main notions that we can find in Latin America today? Water as commodity. And this comes from the Dublin Declaration, at least it was very explicitly manifested in what is called the Dublin Declaration 1992, and it's water has an economic value and all its competing uses and should be recognized as an economic asset. Following this principle, and now is where the human right to water will be included, following this principle that water is and has an economic value, it is especially crucial to recognize the basic right of all human beings to have access to drinking water and sanitation at affordable price. So we have here the more traditional economist language to talk about water. The second notion is water as a fundamental human right. And here is just to remind us, the human right to water entitles everyone to have access to sufficient, safe, acceptable, culturally acceptable, physically accessible, and affordable water for personal and domestic use. Something similar for the right to sanitation that entitles everyone to have physical and affordable access to sanitation in all spheres of life, not only at home, not only in our household, but also in where we work and where we study. That is, this sanitation, access to sanitation must be safe, hygienic, secure, and socially and culturally acceptable, and that provides privacy and ensures dignity. Those rights, continues the declaration, shall be delivered in a participatory, accountable, and non-discriminatory manner. So we can see this is different notion of water and our relation to water, comparing with the previous one. And finally, water as commons, and I'm taking this definition from a seminal word from Karen Bakker, it's a Canadian geographer. She says, water is a flow resource essential for life and ecosystem health. No substitutability, sorry, this is very hard for me to pronounce, so cannot be substituted for other entities, artificial water or something like that, and tightly bound to communities and ecosystems through the hydrological cycle. And she added, collective management by communities is not only preferable, but also necessary, because this is a definition much more located in particular places. So I will show you a new diagram. This is maybe more original from my elaboration, but although it's based again on this work I mentioned from Karen Bakker, the commons versus the commodity. So we have the notion of the common good. And the common good, it's a notion of water that is related with more situated, cannot be separated from the territories. It's embedded in social life, so it's not autonomous. It's not something related, for instance, to the sphere of economics or to the legal sphere of the human right. It's something more complex, more intertwined in everyday life, and also sometimes is considered sacred. So this is part of the definition of water as a common good. A second notion that we have already mentioned is economic good. And this is a notion placeless. It's more abstract. It's water is almost the same everywhere in this language of valuation. And it's a water that must be domesticated, controlled, and this is why technology and the language of technology it's generally related with this notion of economic good, of water as economic good, and finally can be also commodified. And there is a trend to relate and to conceive water as another commodity. And I think the last news coming from Wall Street about the future markets for water somehow it's a signal, a clear signal of this trend. And we have the human right to water and sanitation, that as I have already mentioned, it's related with public good. And this is a universal notion of water, could be individual or collective rights, and also has been observed, sometimes criticized, as a kind of anthropocentric notion of water. So we have these three notions, and if we put it together, the human right to water and the economic and water as an economic good, we have what we can be called commodity perspective. This is the commodity perspective. And on the other hand, if we put together the notion of the human right to water as a public, as water as a public good, together with common good as a kind of alliance, conceptual alliances, we have what can be called dwelling perspective. And here I'm taking inspiration from the British anthropologist Tim Ingold, from his book, The Perception of the Environment, that he works this idea, this contrasting idea of the dwelling perspective against or vis-a-vis the commodity perspective. And the dwelling perspective is a perspective from within the world. It's not something that is observed from outside, that the commodity perspective leads us to do. And in this regard, what I'm trying to say and to reframe, I will come back later, is that if we are going to look at the mapping of cultural water heritage, we must look at this dwelling perspective. The Latin American experiences based on the dwelling perspective are a water cultural heritage to be promoted, to be visualized, to be explored, to be researched, and to be somehow to work together with them. And just a few notes, maybe it's not so pertinent, but I was following the work of the special rapporteur for the human right to water and sanitation, that nowadays is the Spanish economist Pedro Arrojo Agudo, and in his last document or report to the Committee of the Human Rights at the United Nations, she made a diagnosis of the current global water crisis, and he identifies these structural flows I'm showing on the top of the slide. And he said there are two structural flows in current development models. One is this unsustainability of the aquatic ecosystems, and the second one is the poverty and inequality and discrimination that prevails under the current socioeconomic order. These structural flows has been aggravated, or the global crisis, the water global crisis has been aggravated because of the trend to the commodification and financialization of water, climate change, and of course the coronavirus disease and the pandemic that we are still experiencing. And for me, it's very interesting to see the challenges for his mandate that he states and say, in one hand, clarifying ways to promote democratic water and sanitation governance. And he connects this directly with community and indigenous-based water management. So for his mandate, he's looking to visit and to know more and to clarify what is the place of this community and indigenous-based water management for the global discussion of the human right to water and sanitation. So this idea of more democratic water and sanitation governance. The second challenge for his mandate, he says, is furthering the realization of the human rights to safe drinking water and sanitation, but focusing on restoring the sustainability of aquatic ecosystem. Why? Because he found that many people connect directly with rivers, with lakes, and it's not through technology, although technology is very important, but what the first thing is to do is just to make more healthier aquatic ecosystems. So this is part of the guarantee of the human right to water. And I think why I brought these ideas to my argument is because I believe this is also a trend that I found in this particular work of the special rapporteur that also goes together with the idea of the dwelling perspective. These are points, these are aspects of what I call the dwelling perspective. So going to my third part of the presentation, mapping cultural water heritage, where if I have to recommend, because to be honest with you, I haven't done this work. I haven't done this research yet, although I have some ideas, probably if I will carry on with this or somebody wants to do it. So I'm thinking now about the what is called the Red Vida. This is a network of organizations. It's NGOs, but also community-based organizations, grassroots movements that since 2003 has been working in Latin America, although not only, because there are partners that come in from Canada or even from the United States. So it's an inter-American network, although most of the people who are connected through this network are from Latin America. So this is a kind of observatory, and we have the memories of what happened in the region in the last more than 10 years, almost 20 years, regarding the struggles and the discussions on this dwelling perspective, particularly on the human right to water and sanitation at the beginning, but nowadays about how the common goods is a stronger argument against the appropriation of water as a private mean. So here we have from Colombia, for instance, the Penca de Savila. It's very important working with the community-based water management. But also we have from Uruguay, the Commission of the Defense of Water and Life, that it takes the name from the first committee or commission in Cochabamba, in Bolivia, that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation. And you have from Brazil, and you have also from Mexico, which is very important, and Modatima in Chile, which is struggling for the to recover water for small holders and peasants working on agriculture and livestock production against what is the monoculture production in their area in the southern part of Chile. The second example or suggestion I can make is a platform of agreements it's in Spanish written, it's a platform of agreements for partnership, public-public partnership and public-community partnership. So in this network, there are public organisms, public companies, facilities that work together with the community-based water and sanitation management experiences. And the idea is to exchange technology, to exchange knowledge, to exchange experience, also economic accountability, and there are 2 or 3 interesting experiences of cooperation from Brazil to Bolivia, or between Uruguay, Bolivia, and Colombia. So people from the Uruguayan company, OCE, and I think there is Lorena is participating in this lecture in the audience, and probably she can talk more about this. So OCE is cooperating with some of these other community-based organizations. And finally, if we go to the national level, I think this idea of the dwelling perspective and the discussion around the human right to water and sanitation has been passing from different countries. If Cochabamba and Bolivia was the first, then Uruguay, afterwards Ecuador, whatever, and these discussions didn't finish, didn't end up, or there is new arguments and there are new experiences to talk about. But nowadays, if I have to suggest where to go to look for this dwelling perspective as cultural heritage, we should look at Mexico. That in Mexico there is a current debate, discussion for a proposal that is contested by other actors, but it is a citizen's proposal for a new water general law. In Mexico, the human right to water and sanitation was included in the constitutional law several years ago, and it was written down that in a year time, a new water general law must be elaborated and accepted and voted in the Congress, but it didn't happen. It's more than 10 years, I think. So now there is, again, a new discussion that also we cannot forget that this kind of movements, it's always contested, and sometimes by violent means, as it happened with this defender of the water and the territories of an indigenous community that last year was murdered. And I believe is yet not well known what was who was responsible for that. And the second example is Chile. Chile, it was a laboratory for the notion of water as a commodity and water just as an economic good. And it was rivers were privatized. There were rights to water given to corporations, also to the states, municipalities, whatever. But it was a water market that tried to be built there. And maybe but 2 years ago, there was a social demonstrations, very strong, against the old constitutional law that it's from the time of the dictatorship in Chile, that it was in the 80s. And now there is the chance to build a new constitutional law. And in this new law, the human right to water and sanitation, there are a lot of force to be included, but again, in a more wider sense than it was in the time of the referendum in Uruguay. And so here it's a more notion of water related with the territories and to promote this community-based managerial organizations and experiences. So these are the two national focus if nowadays we want to understand and promote this cultural heritage that it's part of our short and medium-term memories. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. Keep in touch. This is my email, and I'm ready for questions.